in a side chamber of the Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion in Axum, Ethiopia. A codex bound in wooden boards and cracked hide sits inside a cedar box. It is written in Ge'ez. It has not left that building in living memory, and the priest who keeps the key does not open it for visitors. Church leaders voted the book it belongs to out of the canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Removed. Banned. Called dangerous. For 17 centuries in the West, it stayed that way. Then, in 1947, 11 separate copies of it surfaced in the caves at Qumran. 11. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy. More than Exodus. More than most books that stayed in the Old Testament. Whoever hid those scrolls did not treat this text as fringe material. They copied it more carefully than the law. And what those copies describe is the world before the flood, not as a moral fable, as a record. The text states that 200 beings descended onto a named mountain, that their leaders are listed by name with the number of men under each, that they took human wives, that the offspring were something other than human, and that the corruption of the human line was not accidental. It was taught, not a myth, not a metaphor. He gives the landing site. He gives the head count. He names the instructors and lists the exact subject each one taught. In the next several minutes, you will see what the text says, what geneticists found buried inside the human genome in 2011 and again in 2020, and why access to the Axum manuscripts has been restricted since 1974. If forbidden history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from the record. But here's what makes this stranger. The passage is not one chapter. It runs from chapter 6 through chapter 11, the opening movement of what scholars call the Book of the Watchers. And it is the oldest layer of the entire book. Fragment 4Q201, held by the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, preserves this section in Aramaic on leather dated to roughly 200 BCE. That is older than any surviving text of the New Testament, by more than 2 centuries. Joseph Millick, who edited the Qumran Enoch fragments in his 1976 Oxford edition, concluded the Aramaic tradition behind these chapters was already old when it was copied. Michael Mibb's 1978 translation from the Ethiopian manuscripts and Ephraim Isaac's 1983 edition remain the 2 standard English versions, and both preserve something the older popular editions blur. The level of detail is wrong for ancient literature. Apocalyptic writing deals in symbols, beasts with horns, numbers that mean something other than what they say. Chapter 6 opens with none of that. It opens with a census. Chapter 6-6 states the number that came down as 200 and gives the location by name. The summit of Mount Hermon, a real mountain. It stands on the modern border between Lebanon and Syria, 9,232 feet at its peak, snow-capped most of the year, visible from most of the Galilee. Chapters 6-7 then lists the leadership. 19 names, Semjaza first, then Armaros, Barakijal, Kokabel, Ezekiel, Sariel, Azazel. The text calls them chiefs of tens, which is an administrative rank. 200 personnel, 19 officers, 1 site. And chapter 6-4 records that they bound themselves by mutual oath before descending because they anticipated consequences and wanted no one able to defect. That is not the behavior of a symbol. That is an operational decision made by a group that expected to be held responsible. The mountain name carries it further. Hermon, in the Semitic root he-hrm, is the same root behind the word therim, which surface reads as consecrated or set apart, and reads more troublingly as placed under a ban, sealed off, forbidden to approach. The text is telling you the site is quarantined, and telling you in the place name, and this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 3 parts: the descent, the curriculum, the offspring. The descent we have covered. 200 named ranks, a named mountain, a sworn oath. The second part is where the text stops resembling anything else written in the ancient world. Chapter 8 is a list, not a narrative, a list of instructors and the exact subject each one delivered. Chapter 8 to 1 states that Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, showed them the metals of the earth and the working of them. Then, in the same verse, cosmetics, bracelets, ornaments, the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids, all kinds of costly stones and coloring tinctures. Chapter 8 to 3 continues the roster. Samjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armaros, the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal, astrology. Kokabel, the constellations. Ezequiel, the knowledge of the clouds. Sariel, the course of the moon. The mainstream reading is that this is a folk explanation for the origin of sin. Read it as what it actually is: metallurgy and the extraction of ore, weapons manufacture and body armor, mineral cosmetics, and antimony is a real metalloid, real ancient eyeliner, genuinely toxic, pigment chemistry, celestial mechanics and the lunar cycle, meteorology, botanical extraction. That is a syllabus, ordered by discipline, attributed by instructor. He had no framework for that. Ancient literature does not itemize technology transfer by department. It says, a god gave men fire. It does not assign 19 officers to 19 subjects and record which one handled cloud observation. But the text doesn't stop there. The third part is the offspring, and the language changes when it gets there. Chapter 7 to 2 records that the women bore children who were not like their fathers or their mothers. Chapter 7 to 5 describes what those offspring did as consumption. They devoured the produce of human labor until humans could no longer sustain them, and then they turned on animals, on birds, on reptiles, on fish, and then on each other. The text is describing an organism that outpaces its food supply. And then comes the part that shouldn't be possible. Chapter 15 is where the text explains the mechanism, and it explains it in terms of biology rather than morality. Verses 8 and 9 state that these offspring, because they were produced from two different kinds, are neither one thing nor the other, and that when the bodies die, the surviving component does not go where human dead go. It has no destination. It stays here. Not possessed, not cursed, hybrid. The text's objection is not that a rule was broken. Its objection is that two lineages that were never meant to combine were combined, and the result had nowhere in the created order to belong. Here's what the translators left out. Go back to chapter 7 to 1, to the phrase, in Semjaza's curriculum. R.H. Charles, whose 1906 English translation is still the version most people quote online, renders it as charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots. Magic. Superstition. A footnote in Charles dismisses the whole passage as folklore about sorcery, which is how it has been read ever since. The Aramaic behind it does not read that way. The phrase for cutting of roots is a horticultural and pharmacological construction. It is the technical language of extraction, of taking the active portion of a plant out of the plant. Isaac's 1983 rendering from the Ethiopian manuscripts keeps that sense visible where Charles buries it. Read alongside the mineral chemistry in verse 8 to 1, the antimony, the tinctures, the smelted metals. The passage is not describing spells. It is describing applied chemistry, and it is describing it in the same breath as weapons and metallurgy, because that is where it belongs. Chapter 8 to 2 then gives the outcome in one word. The GES verb, rendered in English as corrupted, comes from a root whose surface meaning is spoiled or made unclean, and whose harder meaning is ruined at the source, damaged in a way that carries forward. Not that people behaved badly, that something upstream was altered, and everything downstream inherited it. The Aramaic word for the offspring themselves carries the same double edge. The fragments use nephilim from the root meaning to fall. The same root, in later usage, produces the ordinary word for a miscarriage, a thing born that should not have completed. The text moves on, but the implication sits there. What modern readers don't realize is how closely this matches what geneticists have found inside living human DNA. In 2011, a team led by Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a study of genetic variation in 3 sub-Saharan African populations. They found segments of DNA that could not have come from the modern human lineage. The segments were too divergent, too old, and they traced back to a population that split off long before modern humans existed. The problem was that no such population appears in the fossil record, anywhere. In 2020, Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman at UCLA published a follow-up in Science Advances using a far larger dataset from West African genomes. They confirmed it and put numbers on it. Somewhere between 2 and 19% of the ancestry in those populations comes from an archaic lineage that separated from the line leading to modern humans and Neanderthals before those two diverged from each other and interbred with modern humans afterward. Geneticists call it a ghost lineage. There are no bones, there is no skull, no jaw, no tooth. The only evidence that this population ever existed is that its DNA is still in people who are alive today. The text describes a separate kind that interbred with humans and left its inheritance in the human line. The genetics found a separate kind that interbred with humans and left its inheritance in the human line, and left nothing else at all. The parallel is not metaphorical. It is structural, and it is not a single result. In 2018, Vivienne Slan and colleagues published in Nature the genome of a bone fragment from Denisova Cave in Siberia, cataloged as Denisova 11. The individual was a teenage girl who died roughly 90,000 years ago. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. 2 distinct human populations, separated for hundreds of thousands of years, and this was a first-generation child of both. She was found because of a single fragment of bone, less than an inch long, pulled out of a sediment pile. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, where the book was excluded from the approved list of readings. The objection recorded was that it was not received. The problem underneath it was chapters 6 through 11, because a text that names a mountain, counts personnel, and lists a curriculum is making claims that can be checked. And claims that can be checked are dangerous in a way that visions of beasts are not. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, classed Enoch as apocryphal without engaging the content. Augustine, in the City of God around 426 CE, took the giants seriously enough to argue about them at length, and then ruled the Enochic writings too old and too uncertain to trust. Neither man addressed the syllabus. Neither explained why a Judean text would organize the corruption of the world as a departmental list. The Ethiopian church, outside Rome's reach, kept the book in its canon and kept copying it. That is the only reason a complete version survived at all. When the Scottish traveler James Bruce carried 3 guys' manuscripts out of Ethiopia in 1773, European scholarship treated them as a curiosity rather than a source. Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation in 1821. Charles followed in 1906 with the footnotes that turned the extraction chemistry into sorcery. Then, the modern pattern. The Qumran Enoch fragments were assigned low publication priority when the scrolls were cataloged in the 1950s, and Millick's edition did not appear until 1976, nearly 3 decades after discovery. And in 1974, following the Ethiopian Revolution, the new government classified church archives as national cultural property. Access to the Axum collection has been controlled ever since, and outside examination of the manuscripts held there has effectively not happened. Now, here's where it gets active. The Axum collection has become harder to reach in the last 5 years, not easier. Between 2020 and 2022, armed conflict in the Tigray region closed the city to outside researchers entirely. And the condition and location of individual manuscripts held by the church through that period has not been publicly documented by any independent survey since. And on the genetic side, the ghost lineage remains exactly what it was in 2011, a signal with no body. Multiple teams have now confirmed the introgression. Not one of them can tell you what the population looked like, where it lived, or when it disappeared. It exists only as an inheritance. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying the Book of Enoch is a laboratory report on archaic hominin introgression. It is not a genetics paper, and it was not written by anyone with access to a genome. But what the text describes, when you read it carefully, matches the documented findings with uncomfortable precision. It describes a separate population that interbred with humans. Genetics found 1. It describes offspring that were neither one lineage nor the other. Denisova 11 was exactly that. It describes the resulting inheritance as something carried forward in the line, rather than a single event. Introgressed DNA is precisely that, still present in living people at measurable percentages. It describes a technological transfer arriving all at once: metals, weapons, pigments, extraction, and it organizes that transfer by instructor and subject. He had no fossil record, he had no sequencing, he should not describe hybridization as a contamination of a lineage rather than a sin, and he should not itemize it. And yet, the text sits there, in GE and Aramaic, in fragments dated 2 centuries before the Gospels, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If a population outside the modern human lineage really did interbreed with humans, if the genetic inheritance from that population is still present and still measurable, if no fossil of that population has ever been recovered, and if a text older than the Roman Empire describes all of that in plain language, with a head count, a site, a curriculum, and a hybrid outcome, then the text is not mythology. It is documentation. He wasn't interpreting signs, he was documenting what he encountered. Enoch writes it down the way you'd file an incident report. Who arrived, how many, where, what they taught, and what the result was. The world he describes before the flood is either a symbol we have misread for 2 millennia, or it is exactly what he says it is: an event with participants, a location, and consequences that outlived it. The manuscripts remain in Axum, behind stone and government restriction. Fragment 4, Q201, sits in Jerusalem, under glass, in Aramaic. The bone fragment from Denisova Cave is in a laboratory drawer in Leipzig. The ghost lineage is in a database, and in the blood of hundreds of millions of living people who have never heard of it. Mount Hermon is still standing, the name still means what it means. And whatever the text says came down onto that summit, left something behind that is still here, still inherited, still in us, exactly the way Enoch said it would be. There is another investigation on screen now. Every one of them starts with a document someone decided you should not read.